All right, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our study, our verse by verse study through the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 8. Time-wise, this, excuse me, we're coming into the home stretch of Jesus' ministry, earthly ministry, that is. So we're probably within the 6 months time frame. In other words, and you'll see during this period of time, like the last 6 months, he does the greatest or the most mightiest miracles. And the reason why that's important because later in the chapter he's going to ask a question. Who do men say that I am? And that's a very important question. Who do men say that I am? So the idea is that what kind of based upon, if you base it upon what has been revealed. In other words, Jesus says, who do men say that I am? Then you say, well, based upon what has been revealed. Sadly, if we ask the question today, many would answer the question according to a cultural perspective or a religious perspective or a denominational perspective. And of course, the idea is start with what God has revealed. And that's why we have the Gospels. All right, so we'll see this later on in the chapter, but it's a very important question that Jesus is going to ask. Now, it's important in the context here because of what the crowd was shown about Jesus revealed. And so their answer is going to be interesting. All right. So, Mark's Gospel 8 and verse 1 says, in those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. He summoned his disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way. And some of them have come a long distance. Now, let me just say this. This is kind of very interesting here where Jesus makes this observation. They had been with Jesus for 3 days, unintentionally. In other words, this wasn't a planned meeting. Today, we call them conferences, right? There are still meetings that are called camp meetings, okay? Even though they don't really do camping, but, camp meetings of yesteryears, let's say, not the yesteryears, when you would have these open field meetings. Later, that developed into tent meetings. And then, of course, now we have hotel conference centers. So what's called camp meeting today is basically really, really very luxurious. Well, back then, this was kind of an unintentional meeting. They just gathered and wouldn't leave. They was just that hungry for Jesus' word. They were captivated by his teaching. Okay. So he says, he has compassion on the crowd. Why? Because they have stayed there. Now, probably those who did have something to eat had probably depleted it. Anyway, verse 4, his disciples answered, where can anyone get enough bread in this desolate place to fill the people? Now, this is kind of also interesting, too, because maybe I'm being very presumptuous because, again, I have the benefit of knowing the story and not kind of living in the moment. But I often think, well, wouldn't you naturally think, instead of asking that question, well, Jesus, you're the man, right? Remember, he had fed 5,000. It was not that long a period ago that he fed 5,000. So the question is, why aren't they thinking that? In other words, Jesus, you feed them, right? Just like you did before. Remember, Mark says, too, as Mark points out, there's a hardness of the heart, okay? And that's why they're not processing this. So, verse 5, how many loaves do you have? He asked them. 7, they said. And he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke the loaves, and kept on giving them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served the loaves to the crowd. So they served, verse 7, they also had a few small fish, and when he had blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. And they ate and were filled, and they collected 7 large baskets leftover pieces, and about 4,000 men were there. And he dismissed them, and immediately got into a boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha, if I pronounced that right. Now, again, very interesting. I did this. I like this because it's kind of a trivial thing here. Remember, the 4,000 number is just men. They just didn't count the women. Women didn't count back then. But just interesting that just kind of I'll give you kind of a scope of this here. When I started, I worked in the hotel business, so the term food and beverage is everything in the hotel industry. And when you want to have a conference and stuff, that's one of the biggest things there. And but I'm not going to go that fancy either. Just 4,000 people would be an extremely large, by the way, banquet. Okay? But if you just went with 4,000, and let's just say if we went to McDonald's, a McDonald's sandwich, fish sandwich, because remember he fed them fish and bread, but a McDonald's fish sandwich costs about $3.79. Okay? And if you just with the 4,000 men, that's $15,000. Okay? Now, as I said, since they didn't count the women and children, then you could certainly assume that the crowds, that the numbers would swell easily to 15 to 20,000, maybe even more. In other words, just counting wife and one child, remember there were entire families there. So just estimate of 15,000, then you would spend just on one fish sandwich for each person $56,850. And if you go with the 20,000 number, it would be like $75,000. Now, I just like to do that. It has no bearing on the lesson, but just to give you kind of a scope, Jesus did it for free, right? He did it for free by the power of God. He did it for free. But actually, it was even more because remember, he says here that they ate and were filled. So not and if you look, remember he said he kept on giving it to them. He kept on giving. Okay, he kept on. Look at let's go back a little bit, just to verse number. Where is the number at here? 5, and he says, look at verse 5. How many loaves do you have? Verse 6. That's what I want to. Verse 6. Then he commanded the crowd to sit down. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke it and kept on giving to them. So, again, a miracle. Now, this was a miracle, by the way, the crowd saw. Now, there were some of the miracles that the crowds never saw, like Jesus walking on the water, the transfiguration, which we'll get to in the next chapter. But so the crowds didn't see that, but they did see that. Now that's important for later on down in this chapter here. They saw this. They were even gathered because of the crowd, because of his teachings, his miracles, his healings. All right. let's see, verse 11. He says, the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. Now, think about this. Now, these are the Pharisees doing this. They know about the sign. What sign are they looking for? In other words, the request is simply because they have scores of signs. And just so you know, they wasn't looking for a sign that would convince them to believe. In John chapter 9, there was a man who was born blind, and Jesus heals him. So there's your sign right there. So what did the Pharisees do? They questioned if the man was born blind. They kept pressing the man to try to denounce Jesus. So Jesus kind of recognized their game. So where am I at here? So verse 12, he says, but sighing deeply in the spirit, he said, why does this generation demand a sign? I assure you, no sign will be given to this generation. Now, actually, we know from the other Gospels, he says, except for the sign of Jonah. Then he left them, got aboard a boat again, and went to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread, and had only one loaf with them in the boat. Then he commanded them, watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. That's kind of interesting. Jesus is thinking about this, and then notice here, if we go back, remember, he sighed at them. He was annoyed with the Pharisees. And think about this. He's thinking about this now. He's thinking about this. And so he tells them, beware of the yeast. Now, of course, they should have picked up on this. Right? Watch out and beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. These both men are not selling bread. Okay. And the word yeast, by the way, Jesus is using the word yeast, which is also bread, but it's also, you could say, leaven or unleavened. And the idea that under the law, they were in preparation for the Passover meal, they were not to use leaven. And leaven was that element, that yeast that causes the bread to rise and all that. But it also spiritually symbolizes what? The mixing of the pure commands of God. And now Jesus is even telling them, don't mix the pure commands of God or the purity of God. So he says, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Okay? Both. Think about that. Both. And he's warning them of both. So what do? Verse 16, and they were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this. In other words, they begin to blame one another. You know, Peter, I thought you was bringing the bread. No, John, I thought you were bringing the bread. Bartholomew, both of y'all messed up. And Jesus is like, why are you, verse 17, aware of this, he said to them, why are you discussing that you do not have any bread? Do you not understand or comprehend? Is your heart hardened? Now, Jesus asked this question again. In other words, you're squabbling over bread. And obviously, they went a little extra with the arguing as if it was so grim, right? Because Jesus is saying, okay, if it came down to it, this one loaf can be multiplied, right? That's kind of like, really? And he's really even blasting them for what? Missing his point, which they should have been able to keen in on. Verse 18, do you have eyes and not see? And do you have ears and not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets of fishes of pieces did you collect? 12, they told him. When I broke this loaf for the 4,000, how many loaves of basket did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, do you not understand? And think about this. Remember, they should have picked up on this. And this is what Jesus is rebuking them for. Y'all should have put this together. And so in some respect, they were contaminated by the yeast of the Pharisees. And this is something, if I was teaching a series, this could be a whole series itself, how contaminated we are with denominational yeast. You could say that we're contaminated by religious yeast, right? All right, verse 22. Then he came to Bethsaida. Now this is how you doing, brother? Hidden Jesus. Hi, brother. All right. So Bethsaida, remember, which is kind of interesting too, in context here, in context of what we're talking about, is remember six of his apostles were chosen from this city. Peter and Andrew, James and John, Nathaniel, and Nathaniel's mother, Philip. Now think about that. So, and when he mentions the yeast of the Pharisees, to me that would go directly to them, because actually, if you think about this, the yeast of Herod, and because he mentions Herod, which is kind of odd, the other 6 disciples kind of come from a mixture. We know one of them is a zealot, and so again, the ideology, the mind contamination, you could say, probably kind of reaches to his disciples when he tells them this. Verse 22 again, they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out to the villages. Spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look to me like trees walking. Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes, and he saw distinctly. And he was cured. He can see everything clearly. Then he sent him away, saying, don't even go into the villages. Now, again, a lot of times when Jesus would give this command, he basically would tell them, he didn't want to draw the crowds at that time, and he would just, it wasn't, again, if you were blind, and again, the logic here is that if you were blind, people know you're blind, or people know you have a condition, and you get miraculously healed from it. In other words, Jesus wasn't saying that you can't conceal that. Like, what are you going to say? Again, a lot of times this was to say he didn't want attention at that time for whatever purpose at that time. Let's see. All right, verse 27. Jesus went out with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? Excuse me. They answered, John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But you, he asked them again, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And he strictly warned them not to tell no one about him. And again, this would, you kind of keep this in the mind in the present ministry. And there are several reasons you could say why Jesus would say that. You were going to see a series of when the Sadducees and the Pharisees would try to trap Jesus. One of their ploys would be, are you king, or are you king of the Jews? And the reason why that's important, how you answer that, is because it can be taken as treason against Rome. if Jesus says he was the Son of God, it can be taken as blasphemy against God. And so, let's see. Oh, I continue. Okay, brother. I won't be able to comment. I'm moving you to my big screen while I clean the house. God bless you. Thanks. All right. Okay, good. All right, brother. I guess, let me see. This is the other one. Oh, I am good. How are you? All right. All right, brother. Do your thing. Okay. All right. All right. So, but anyway, so when he says to them, but you go back to the original question here, and what is interesting about the question. What is interesting about the question here, he says, who do people say that I am? The answer is, even for this generation, the answer is kind of sad. Now you may think, now go back, look at this, because this is kind of interesting right here. He says, who do people say that I am? Verse 28. Jesus answered him, John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. So we can ask the question, why would they assume that? Why would they come to that conclusion? If Jesus, I should have brought this up, but when John 1 tells us, I'm going to read it here because I think it is important here. I think it is important. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, and I'm going to read this because, again, it is so important, especially to this question that Jesus is asking. So John chapter 1, now let me read. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him not one thing was created that has been created. Excuse me. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. Now I'm going to skip down to verse 14. Now this is important now. The Word became flesh. So we know who the Word is. John identifies the Word as God, with God in the beginning, but then the Word becoming flesh. Now the term word here is the word really that it means to give expression to a thought or a concept or an ideal, okay? And actually the Greek word of it is logos, okay? So the idea that they use the term word logos in many fashions, but the idea is that the word, by using the word, it basically what he's saying is that Jesus gives expression. He gives thought. He reveals and gives expression to the invisible God. But it's even more than that. It's a lot more deeper than that. If you was to travel back through eternity, you go back, far as you can go back, past the creation of the material universe, past the creation of the elements that creates the universe. You go all the way back in time, and you would run into God. Now think about that, because God is the beginning. All things starts with God, with Him, everything. So you go far back as you can possibly go back, and you would run into God. But wait, not only would you run into God, you would run into the Word. That's what John is telling us right here. You would run into the Word. And the reason why is because the Word, the point is what you would see if you travel it all the way back through eternity past is that which God reveals himself. In other words, you would go all the way back until you would run into the Word, but it's what is revealed. In other words, it's what God would want you to see. The image that God would want you to see of himself. The revelation of God, the manifestation of the revelation of God is the Word. That's important. So then he says, verse 14 again, the Word became flesh and took up residency among us, and we observed, this is what we observed, his glory, the glory as of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. That is what, when the Word became flesh, that is what God is showing, revealing. Okay, that is the revelation of the Word. So when Jesus asks the question, who do men say that I am? This is their answer, because this is what they've seen. To say that it's one of the Elijah, that's not what he revealed. To say that he's one of the prophets, he's Elijah, that is not what he revealed. What are they looking at? And that's the sad thing, because they failed to see what God had revealed in the person of his Son. Now, verse 31, he says, then he began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and rise after 3 days. He was openly talking about this. He was openly talking about this. So Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around, looking up on his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan, because you are not thinking about God's concerns, but man's." Now, think about this now. Jesus tells him he's going to die, having said he is the Son of God. And Jesus rebukes him, right? Peter says, hey, really, in some respects, he says, to save yourself. Where am I going here? Wrong one. Peter, notice it. Peter begins to rebuke him. No, you have to save yourself. Don't do this. Now, and get the scene here. Get the scene that Mark paints. He looks around. He looks at the disciples, and he's looking at them, and then he sharply rebukes Peter. One of the sharpest rebukes. He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Now, he wasn't just using a slur. Like if I say "you devil," I mean it as a slur. The word Satan means adversary. In fact, the word devil means accuser of the brethren. What Jesus basically was saying here was that, Peter, you're being an adversary. You are coming against the plan of God. Because think about this. What if Jesus had listened to Peter? Of course, that's an impossibility right here, right? But to be very, very hypothetical, what if Jesus said, after thinking about it, Peter, you're right. Why should I go through all this? I'm the Son of God. Let me go back to heaven, right? Just think about the effects of that, the consequences of that. We're still in our sins, right? But now, so he says, verse 34, he says, summoning the crowd along with his disciples. So then he says, okay, everybody, I want y'all to gather around. Everybody. Now, remember, there was this crowd were probably kind of more of immediate you could say immediate disciples or extended disciples. Okay. So he says, if anyone wants to be my follower, he must deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Right? Take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever wants to lose his life for my sake, because of me, and the gospel will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world, yet loses his life? And what can a man give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he come into his glory of his fathers with his holy angels. Now, this is, of course, one of the most powerful instructions that Jesus gives to his us, right? Not only his disciples with us, because remember, he gathered the crowd too. So he wanted all of his followers to hear this. So not only the 12, but he also gets the other crowd, excuse me, because he wants them to hear this. And he says that if you want to be my disciples, okay, if you want to be my disciples, you must deny yourself. This is a primary command that had never changed. Now get this, it doesn't change according to culture. It doesn't change according to the times. So if you want to be his follower, right? If you want to be his follower, he says you must deny yourself. Now, let me just say this right here. This becomes the answer to all of the issues of the day. The transgender issue, the gay issues, right? The feminist issue. We can go on and on and on. These hot topic issues of the day, right? Person, the message. And one of the things that I have to get into an argument with a person over the gay issue. And by the way, there are people that are born again gay. No, we ain't gonna argue with that. Because if you come to Christ, if you come to Jesus, are you coming to Jesus denying yourself or affirming yourself? Okay? So he says you must deny yourself. Why? Because if you seek to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life, you will save it. But that doesn't mean that you're going to have what you want in terms of this life. Because notice he said, what if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? And there are millions of people who fit that category. By the way, it's not only just, you could say, on different levels. If you gain the whole world and lose your soul. Think about that. And then he says, if you are ashamed of me in this adulterous and sinful generation, he says, the Son of Man will be ashamed when you come into his glory of his Father. And there might be a hint here as to why the motive of why Jesus is saying it in reaction to Peter rebuking him. It doesn't matter, but the point is that he's telling his disciples, this is non-negotiable. That you and your surrender to me is always non-negotiable. You know it doesn't it is anyway, but that so if you want to be his disciples, if anyone wants to be my follower, he must deny himself. It doesn't get any plainer than that. All right, guys, chapter 9 in our next study. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I will see you in the next study. All right, bye-bye. Till then.